This time we're going to look at some Greek words that are used rather sparingly in the New Testament. Leitourgeo. This is Strong's number 3008, and there are 3 instances in the New Testament. Threskeia, which is Strong's number 2356, and there are 4 of these in the New Testament, and one more of the related word Threskeia. And finally a group of related words known as the Sebo family. Sebo, Sebozomai and Eusebio, respectively. These are Strong's numbers 4576, 4573 and 2151. Now there are 13 instances of words in the Sebo family in the New Testament. But all these words together only occur 20 times in the whole New Testament, which is why we're going to cover them all in this video. Let's start with Leitourgeo. Now the Greek here isn't that different from English, so if you know the odd letters you can work it out. The first letter is lambda for the opening L, and the next 4 letters sound like you expect. Then what looks like a P is actually a rho, giving us the R sound. Then that Y-like thing is actually gamma, a G. Then another EO to finish, Leitourgeo. And if you're seeing this and thinking liturgy, then well done. This is where the English word comes from. But Leitourgeo is based on 2 other Greek words, leos, which means people, and ergon, which means work. Now if you paste Leitourgeo into Google Translate, the English it returns for modern Greek is I operate. So yes, it's about doing stuff. What sort of stuff? Well, in ancient Greek culture, before they had government budgets for this sort of thing, a rich man might try and boost his popularity by building a new town hall, paving the marketplace, putting in new drains or whatever, and this was called a Leitourgeo, a public service at your expense for the good of the community. Well, that's classical Greek, but how does it change in the New Testament? The first time we see Leitourgeo is in Acts chapter 13 and verse 2 at the church in Antioch. While they were worshipping the Lord and fasting, the Holy Spirit said, "Set apart for me Barnabas and Saul for the work to which I've called them." And that word translated worshipping is Leitourgeo, and yes, work is ergon. For the Leitourgeo, the NIV and many other translations have worshipping, others have serving or ministering to. And hopefully that reminds us of the Hebrew words aboda and abad, which you may remember from video 3, which mean work, worship and service. The text doesn't say what form this Leitourgeo took, but in verse 1 we read who was doing it. Now in the church at Antioch there were prophets and teachers, Barnabas, Simeon, called Niger, Lucius of Cyrene, Manaen, who had been brought up with Herod the Tetrarch, and Saul. And that's Acts chapter 13 verse 1. So it's not a general congregation, but what you might call a leaders' meeting of 5 prophets and teachers, Barnabas, Simeon, Lucius, Manaen and Saul. That is Paul. So we know who was doing it, but we don't know exactly what they were doing, except it involved fasting. Next time we see the word is in Romans chapter 15 and verse 27. Here Paul is talking about his travel plans and how he wants the Romans to take up a collection for Paul to take to the poor. In the verse before he talks about how the Christians in Macedonia and Achaia had taken one up. Now he wants the Romans to do the same. We'll look at the New King James Version because the NIV and a lot of other translations don't have a single word for the Leitourgeo. So Paul says of the Macedonian and Achaean Christians, "It pleased them indeed, and they are their debtors, for if the Gentiles have been partakers of their spiritual things, their duty is also to minister to them in material things." That's Romans chapter 15 verse 27 in the New King James Version. Yes, that minister is Leitourgeo. This time it's not doing something directly for God, but for other Christians, collecting some money for Paul to take and give to the poor. Finally, in Hebrews 10 and verse 11, the writer is contrasting Christ's once and for all sacrifice with the continuing work of the priests in the temple. He writes, "Day after day, every priest stands and performs his religious duties. Again and again, he offers the same sacrifices which can never take away sins." That's Hebrews chapter 10 and verse 11. And that performs his religious duties is from Leitourgeo. So now it's about the rituals in the temple which can never take away sins. We've got 3 different uses with 3 different slants, but each time it's about doing a religious duty. In Acts 13 verse 2, it's ministering to or worshipping God. It doesn't say how, but it involves fasting. In Romans 15 verse 27, it involves giving money to support the poor. And in Hebrews chapter 10 verse 11, it's the rituals in the temple. This one's a little trickier to pronounce. Threskeia. Now that first letter, which looks like an O with a crossbar, is theta, which is a th sound. Next is not a P but a rho, which is a r sound. Next is not N but an eta for an E sound, and then a sigma for the S. The rest looks reasonably English like Keia. So we have Threskeia. Threskeia appears 5 times in the New Testament. Twice in the mouth of Paul, once in Acts, once in Colossians, and the other three in James. The first time we see it is in Acts chapter 26 and verse 5. There's a long story, starting in verse chapter 21, involving plots to kill Paul. He's taken into custody by the Romans, who don't really know what to do with him after he tells them he's a Roman citizen. 5 chapters and a long time later, Paul is in front of Agrippa, a client king of the Romans, who asked him what he has to say for himself. You can read the whole speech in chapter 26, but in verse 5 he says of the Jews who want him dead, "They have known me for a long time and can testify, if they're willing, that I conform to the strictest sect of our religion, living as a Pharisee." And that's Acts chapter 26 verse 5. That word translated as religion is Threskeia, and pretty much every English translation uses the same word. So Threskeia means religion. But as we know, Jesus didn't come to found a religion, to build a kingdom. So Paul here uses Threskeia to describe his previous life under Judaism. He never, in any of his surviving writings, uses it to describe his life as a Christian. Next time we see Threskeia is also from Paul, this time in his letter to the Colossians, chapter 2 verse 18. He writes, "Do not let anyone who delights in false humility and the worship of angels disqualify you. Such a person also goes into great detail about what they've seen. They're puffed up with idle notions by their unspiritual mind." And that's Colossians chapter 2 verse 18. And here the word translated worship is Threskeia. Threskeia of angels, that sounds a bit dodgy, and indeed it is. I remember in Revelation chapter 22, the angel gives John a telling off for proskuneing to him. He writes, "I fell down to worship at the feet of the angel who'd been showing them to me, but he said to me, 'Don't do that. I am a fellow servant with you and with your fellow prophets and with all who keep the words of this scroll. Worship God.'" And that's Revelation chapter 22, verses 8 and 9. No, we don't worship angels, thank you very much. Even angels tell us not to worship them. That's why Paul says, listening to someone talking about the Threskeia of angels will disqualify you. So we have Threskeia used twice by Paul. Once he's referring to his old life in Judaism, once for some weird and thankfully lost heresy of angelic worship. Well, I say lost, but I think there's some New Age beliefs and practices that are about venerating, even worshipping angels. No, don't do that. They're servants of God, douleo, just like we are. Anyway, that's how Paul uses Threskeia. How about James? Well, he uses the word, or variants of it, twice in 2 verses, right at the end of the first chapter of his letter. Like Paul, he's using Threskeia to mean something less than a true Christian faith. He writes, "Those who consider themselves religious and yet do not keep a tight rein on their tongues deceive themselves, and their religion is worthless. Religion that God our Father accepts as pure and faultless is this, to look after orphans and widows in their distress and to keep oneself from being polluted by the world." And that's James chapter 1 verses 26 and 7. Now those 2 verses come up after a passage in verses 19 to 25, and he starts there by saying, "My dear brothers and sisters, take note of this. Everyone should be quick to listen, slow to speak, and slow to become angry." And that's verse 19. Well, that connects with a bit about keeping a tight rein on your tongue in verse 26. But then in verse 22 he says, "Do not merely listen to the word and so deceive yourselves. do what it says. I wonder, perhaps the people he's writing to are boasting about how religious they are. Oh yes, terribly Threskeia, terribly religious. And he's coming down on them like a ton of bricks. If you just talk the religious talk, then it's worthless. Faith has to play out in real life, including what you do with your money. And as he goes on to say in chapter 2, faith by itself, if it is not accompanied by action, is dead. And that's James chapter 2, verse 17. And there's no Threskeia in that verse. The word translated faith is pistis, which means faith, belief, trust, confidence, and fidelity. There are 13 words in the Sebo group, and the variants appear 56 times in the New Testament. Here's what you might call the vanilla Sebo. Now the letters are sigma for the S, epsilon for the E sound, and beta for the B and omega for the O. Sebo. Reverend Strong gave Sebo the number 4576, and it's used 10 times in the New Testament. If you paste Sebo into Google Translate for modern Greek, you get back, I respect. But in the New Testament it's used in Matthew and again in Mark, where Jesus quotes Isaiah and says, these people honour me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me. They worship me in vain. Their teachings are merely human rules. And that word worship is Sebo. And that's Matthew chapter 15, verses 8 and 9. And exactly the same words are used in Mark chapter 7, verses 6 and 7. And the verse from Isaiah is from chapter 29, verse 13. Now the Hebrew word behind honour in Isaiah is kabod, which if you recall means honour, splendour and glory. But the word translated as worship is actually yoreh, which means fear, revere, or to be afraid. And it's the same word that Adam uses in Genesis chapter 3 when God asks him why he hid from him. You know how the story goes. After Adam eats the fruit, the Lord called to the man, where are you? He answered, I heard you in the garden, and I was afraid because I was naked, so I hid. And that's Genesis chapter 3, verses 9 and 10. Again, that afraid is yoreh. Isaiah uses it in chapter 29 and verse 13, and when it was translated into Greek, it became Sebo, and translated into English, it becomes worship, but also fear, reverence, and respect. And keep that idea of fear and reverence. Sebo is also used in Acts chapter 29 when Alexander the silversmith is stirring up a riot against the Christians in Ephesus. If you recall, he and others in his trade made souvenir replicas of the goddess Artemis for pilgrims to buy. And in verse 27 he says, there is danger not only that our trade will lose its good name, but also that the temple of the great goddess Artemis will be discredited. And the goddess herself, who is worshipped throughout the province of Asia and the world, will be robbed of her divine majesty. Again, worshipped is Sebo. And the word is also used in Acts to describe God-fearing proselytes and Gentiles. For example, Lydia in chapter 16. One of those listening was a woman from the city of Thyatira named Lydia, a dealer in purple cloth. She was a worshipper of God, and the Lord opened her heart to respond to Paul's message. And that's Acts chapter 16, verse 14. The word translated as worshipper is Sebo. In other places and translations, the same word may be translated as God-fearer. Now, Sebo splits off into 3 variants. Sebasma, which is Strong's number 4574, is used twice, both times to mean an object of worship or an idol, but not God. I'll put up a list of these at the end of the video. Next, sebazomai, which is Strong's number 4573, that's used once in Romans chapter 1, where Paul is describing how humanity abandoned God and turned to worship created things. He writes, they exchanged the truth about God for a lie and worshipped and served the created things rather than the Creator, who is forever praised. Amen. Romans chapter 1, verse 25, and that worshipped is sebazomai. Sebastos is the 3rd variant, and that's used 3 times in Acts to describe the Roman emperor, who of course is the revered one. Okay, so that's Sebo and its close variants. Sebo is taken off in 3 directions by words that add a prefix. First one is eusebeo, and its relatives. In Greek, the eu means true, so it's a way of emphasising the Sebo, true Sebo. There are four Eusebios. It's Strong's number 2151 is Eusebio. Eusebia is Strong's number 2150, and Eusebes is Strong's number 2152. Finally, Eusebos is Strong's number 2153. And all of them are about godliness and piety. Eusebia appears 9 times in Paul's letters to Timothy and 4 times in Paul's second letter, each time referring to Christians, and it's consistently translated as godliness. Then there's Threskeia and its relatives. The theo prefix means God, and there are 2 of these. Threskeia is Strong's number 2317, and it's a noun meaning godliness or piety. Next there's Threskeis, which is Strong's number 2318, and that's an adjective meaning much the same, God-fearing or devout. And these words appear once each in the New Testament. Finally, the way you can change Sebo is by putting an alpha on the front, which negates it. So we have Asebia, Asebis, and Asebio, which are Strong's numbers 763, 765, and 764, and all of them are translated as ungodly or ungodliness. What are we to make of these words? Leitourgeo means serving God, like aboda, the word we looked at in the 3rd video. But we see it only 3 times in the New Testament, though. Once when the church leaders were liturgioing and fasting before they set apart Barnabas and Saul to be missionaries, then once in Romans, where it means contributing money to a collection for the poor. Then a 3rd time in Hebrews, where it refers to the priests offering sacrifices that couldn't take away sin. And of course, from Leitourgeo we get liturgy, which is what the church does in worship, whether it's written down or not. Oh, and of course, this is why we call it a church service, because we go to serve God. Threskeia is religion. Paul uses it first to refer to his old life as a Pharisee, then to condemn the worship of angels as a Threskeia, and finally, James uses it, I think sarcastically, when he's writing to Christians who say they're terribly religious, but whose deeds don't match their words. Finally, Sebo means a reverence and a piety that isn't necessarily bad in itself, though when Jesus uses it, he means, like James, a faith where the words spoken don't reflect what's in the heart. Other times it's the God-fearing Gentiles like Cornelius, who respect and fear God and maybe want to understand him better, but for now it's fear and keeping God at a safe distance. And that same fear that Adam had when he realized he was naked and hid. Contrast that with the Aaronic blessing, may the Lord bless you and keep you, may he make his face shine upon you. And if there's one thing Adam didn't want, it was for God's face to shine upon him. No, he'd rather hide away in those bushes. Now when we get to Eusebio it gets better, and it's about Christian godliness, but overall I see these 3 words as words that mean well and try their best, but mostly don't quite cut it. Well, we're nearly at the end of the New Testament worship words. Next time we'll take a look at the final 3, Sale, Humneo and Ode Pneumatikoi, generally translated as psalms, hymns and spiritual songs. Well done if you've watched all the videos in the series. If you haven't, they're all there up on YouTube. Enjoy.